So good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming, taking time out of your schedule to be here for this presentation. There's a nice number of you all here today, so I'm grateful for your presence today. So as has already been mentioned today, I'll be talking about my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. Imagine a world where the relationship between police and communities of color was void of violence, aggression, and distrust. The reality, however, is that Black citizens disproportionately experience a range of negative police behavior, which in turn affects their attitudes towards the police. But what is even more surprising is that in the past 40 years in the United States, we've been doubling down on investments in the police and in the criminal justice system, but yet we still saw what happened with regards to the Michael Brown incident in Ferguson, as well as the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore. And we certainly saw massive protests taking place across the nation in the aftermath. And this is important to understand because I believe that we can use the protests in both Ferguson and Baltimore to really learn about what we're doing wrong, but also what needs to be done and how we can allocate resources, which I argue is in individuals as well as in marginalized communities. And so that's why today I'm going to be discussing how and why Ferguson and Baltimore really became highly publicized sites for protests against racially biased policing, as well as broader structural inequalities. And I'm also going to discuss what needs to be done to reduce police violence. So as everyone here knows, on August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old African-American male, he was fatally shot by Darren Wilson, a white police officer who at the time worked at the Ferguson Police Department, and he was not charged with the death of Michael Brown. And following the death of Michael Brown, the city of Ferguson really went through civil unrest over what many in the community perceived as another unjustifiable homicide of an unarmed African-American male at the hands of a police officer. So protests along with riots and angry encounters with the police occurred following the shooting. In addition, police handling of protests also received strong criticism from the public because of its militarized use of force and excessive use of force towards demonstrators. Most of us are aware that 8 months after Michael Brown's death, following Michael Brown's death on April 12, 2015, officers from the Baltimore Police Department, they arrested Freddie Gray, who at the time was a 25-year-old African-American male, and he was arrested for illegally possessing a switchblade. He suffered severe neck and spine injuries, which was suffered while he was in police custody, and he ultimately died. So peaceful protests initially arose in Baltimore, but rioting, looting, and arson did break out on the day of Freddie Gray's funeral. Although the Baltimore Police Department, they did initially engage with initial force restraint. That is, they restrained themselves from engaging demonstrators. The police response, however, did become more militarized as protests also became violent. So the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray really gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in 2013 after the murder acquittal of George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin, who at the time was a 17-year-old African-American boy. So because many African Americans, they were tired of the extrajudicial killings of unarmed African Americans from police and self-declared vigilantes, the movement really unfolded as a call to action, demanding changes to the way police handle minorities, but also demanding an end to systemic racism that exists in this nation. So the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, they were two of several high-profile killings that really gave impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so protests at each of these sites, in both in Ferguson and Baltimore, really brought up decades of pent-up emotions of anger, frustration, and outrage from much of the African-American community. And I should say that the use of repressive police tactics that were used during the demonstrations confirmed to many the continued racism and discrimination that many Blacks experience and still suffer at the hands of state institutions, including the police. In fact, following the death of Michael Brown, the Department of Justice, they published a searing report that documented racial bias by the Ferguson Police Department. Based upon data that was collected from the Ferguson Police Department from 2012 to 2014, what they found is that African Americans accounted for 85 to 93% of vehicle stops, citations, as well as arrests, despite comprising of only 67% of the city's population. They also found that African Americans are more than twice as likely as white drivers to be searched during vehicle stops, but yet they were less likely to be in possession of a contraband. Similarly, following Freddie Gray's killing, the Department of Justice also published a blistering report that showed unconstitutional, racially biased policing that was taking place in the Baltimore Police Department. From 2010 to 2015, African Americans made up 82% of people who were stopped for traffic violations, and even though they only comprised of 60% of the city's population that was within the driving age. So African Americans were more likely to be searched, but again, less likely to be found in possession of a contraband compared to individuals of other racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so what all of these statistics are showing us is that African Americans are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested. But what's missing are the narratives from residents in both of these cities who are actually having police encounters. So when we look at the research on race and policing, we know less about women's encounters with the police, especially women of color, as their experiences with law enforcement is often under-examined and really remains pretty invisible in public discourse. In addition, we don't know very much about white individuals' experiences and perceptions of the police. This is likely because white individuals are less likely to experience discriminatory policing compared to African Americans. But at the same time, the lack of attention to the intersection of race, gender, and policing is problematic and surprising, because really race and gender inequalities really cannot be understood in isolation of one another. So I do a deeper dive into these issues in my book. So in this book, I bring together research on race, place, and policing, as well as the literature on social movements to investigate how and why Ferguson and Baltimore really became highly publicized sites for protests. I also analyze how Ferguson and Baltimore residents understand their experiences with the police, and again, how these experiences actually shape their attitudes towards law enforcement. I seek to examine what galvanized the Black Lives Matters as a social movement. And then finally, I seek to examine how police tactics during these demonstrations actually influenced protesters' willingness to engage in subsequent protest events. So I conducted a total of 192 interviews on both residents and protesters in both Ferguson and Baltimore. Specifically, in Ferguson, I conducted 100 initial interviews in Ferguson, which took place in October of 2014, and follow-up interviews were conducted in November of 2014. So in October 2014, I conducted these initial interviews before the decision was made not to indict Darren Wilson. And the reason why I did follow-up interviews is because there was a lot of talk from the participants who I spoke with about speculation as to what would happen if Darren Wilson was not indicted. And so I went back in the following month to get their reactions. I also conducted 92 interviews on Baltimore, Maryland residents and protesters. This was done in June 2015, so this was also 2 months after the death of Freddie Gray. So in both Ferguson and Baltimore, these interviews were conducted during the height of protests that were going on. So individuals, they were recruited to participate in the study if they engaged in any type of street protest. That included marches, rallies, demonstrations. I was interested in people who were actually protesting out on the streets. But I also was aware that there would be people who may not protest, but yet they resided in the cities of Ferguson and Baltimore, and they're still being impacted by what's going on. So I was also interested in hearing their voices as well. And so I recruited people by placing a flyer on social media, at a local community college and university, at a public library, as well as in a minority newspaper. And I should say that I placed an ad in a minority newspaper in St. Louis, and the editor actually had over 7,000 Twitter followers. And so it was very easy for me to get participants to be part of the sample. So I want to turn attention to the accounts of residents in Ferguson and Baltimore in which I examine their experiences with the police and I document both favorable and unfavorable encounters that they had with the police. There were a total of 218 police incident descriptions that were described to me by the participants. Of the 218 police incidences, 148, or essentially 2/3 of these interactions, were said to be negative in nature. 68, or 1/3 of these interactions, were said to be positive in nature, and 2 were considered to be neutral. So I'm going to focus first on the common themes that were identified as it relates to negative encounters with the police, and then I'll move on to talk about the common themes that I identified as it relates to the favorable encounters people had with the police. So the first common theme that was identified had to do with aggressive policing. So in the study, 30% of negative interactions were described by residents as being aggressive in nature or physically violent. So among those who reported such police interactions, 42 were black and 4 were white. And there were some who reported accusations of threats of physical abuse, even though they weren't involved in criminal activity. For example, Montel, he described an incident in which he was stopped by a police officer, which he says was a bogus claim that something was wrong with his tags. He went on to say that one thing led to another and I'm getting body slammed on my face by the police. And actually, during the interview, he actually had a scar on his face because of this incident. There were also some who described police acting aggressively towards male residents, particularly who did live in high crime neighborhoods. For example, Arnold states that the police, they're always screaming right out. They come out right with the aggression first. And so Arnold admitted that where he lives at is a high crime neighborhood, but police often assume that all the residents within that neighborhood are engaged in drug activity or either using or selling drugs. And so he complained that officers often approach residents in a very aggressive fashion. And Darnell, he details an incident that occurred when he was younger. When he was about 16, he talks about how he and his friends were playing basketball, and an officer approached them because it was about to be after hours, and the officers told them that they had to wrap up their game and leave, given that it was about to be after hours at the park. Darnell said he and all of his friends told the officer, okay, they were going to wrap up. However, after the officer left, they decided they were already halfway through the game. They wanted to finish their game before they let out. And Darnell explains what happened. He said the officer comes back. He says, didn't I tell you, mother effers, get the F out. You guys need to leave. My friend throws the rock at his car. He comes back, calls another squad car. There's about 6 of us, and they just whooped on all of us. They hit me in my face once and my ribs twice, saying, y'all need to get on. So there were a few black residents in the study who were physically abused, and they did admit to having engaged in illicit activity. As we can see in Darnell's account, his friend is the one who actually threw a rock at the police officer's car. However, residents also expressed that they still expected officers to operate within the boundaries of the law. And while most of the residents' accounts of police encounters that they had reported to me were within the confines of actually engaging in lawful behavior, for those who engaged in unlawful behavior, they were much more likely to be recipients of more severe forms of police misconduct. And these residents' accounts actually coincide with reports from the Department of Justice in both Ferguson and Baltimore, which did reveal a pattern of excessive use of force that was used disproportionately against African Americans. I should also mention that some residents also reported that black officers were just as aggressive, if not more aggressive, than their white counterparts. Specifically, 25% of residents in the sample made such claims, and they often came from black Baltimoreans. So in Baltimore, at the time of the incident, nearly half of the police force in Baltimore was black. And so Baltimoreans were more likely to come into contact with black officers. If you recall, however, in Ferguson, over 90% of the police force was white. And so very few Ferguson residents actually had direct encounters with black officers. And so, for example, Davina, she says that black police, they curse the black guy out and whatever. They sling him around. Because I've seen them sling my son around, throw him against the wall, just like Freddie Gray. So Davina's views about black officers was tied to her having observed differential treatment they displayed towards men, and even the harsh treatment towards her son. And so as a result, she viewed police officers, black and white, in an unfavorable light. Among the 148 police encounters that occurred in the study, 32% of these interactions were described as racial profiling. Study participants often emphasized the arbitrary nature of officers' decisions to stop and question black males before the deaths of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. For example, Nikesha states that my brother and my boyfriend, because they're African-American males, the police already assume they're up to no good just because of their appearance, the type of car they have, and just the day-to-day basic stereotypes that African-American males today face. So participants in the study, they were well aware of the heightened police suspicion of young black males often had to do with extra legal issues. So for instance, legal issues have to do with such factors as have to do with such factors as speeding or driving erratically, having faulty headlights or taillights. However, extra legal factors has to do with factors such as race, age, gender, and even personal characteristics such as clothing, hairstyles, and even whether or not one has tattoos. And so there were many young black civilians who believed that they were frequently targeted by the police for these reasons. For example, Tyrone says if you've got tattoos and you're young, you're a target. I could just be walking down the street minding my business and I can have my shirt off and the police just pull up on me. What are you doing? Where are you going? They start asking me questions like they my parents. So because the majority of residents who were targeted, they couldn't understand why the police would be viewing them with suspicion, particularly when they were engaged in lawful activity. And so there were some who actually defied police officers' commands when they were stopped by the police. And Tyrone's account is illustrative of this, where and I'll show you in a moment, but basically he details an incident in which he was walking to the bus stop early one morning to go to work, and he mentions how he was stopped by the police. And this is what he says happened. He says, the officer was asking me, like, where are you going? I'm like, why are you asking me where I'm going? It's early in the morning. Obviously, I'm going to work or I'm going to school. Like, leave me alone. Then the officer was like, get down on the ground. I'm like, for what? I'm not getting down on the ground. I'm waiting on the bus. Leave me alone. So he got out of the car and put me in handcuffs. So consequently, Tyrone, he was arrested and locked up for failure to cooperate with an officer. So in this account, we see that Tyrone, he clearly took offense to having been randomly questioned by the officers, and he actually challenged the fairness of this officer's suspicion. The lack of deference that Tyrone displayed towards the police is tied to the fact that he resented being stopped by the police without any legal justification. Tyrone's direct challenge may seem questionable to some, especially since the officer appears to ask an innocuous question, where are you going? But Tyrone, like many black civilians in the study, were routinely viewed with suspicion for being out of place, particularly when they traveled to largely middle-class neighborhoods or white neighborhoods. And in addition, Tyrone, along with many countless black residents in Ferguson and Baltimore, they were often predisposed to mistreatment from local police officers simply because of where they lived. And so entire neighborhoods ultimately ended up being criminalized, regardless of whether or not individual residents were actually engaging in criminal activity. Moreover, the question of where are you going, I should say, has an onerous history. So prior to the Civil War, slave patrollers, they constantly questioned the whereabouts and the activities of slaves. And in an attempt to restrict their movement, authorities enacted criminal statutes that barred slaves from leaving their master's home without permission or without a proper pass. And so there were many black residents in both Ferguson and Baltimore who saw police officers' aggressive tactics as an attempt to try to restrict their movements. And so this really exemplifies how the legacy of race and place continues to play a vital role in discussions about police-civilian relations. While residents objected to being profiled by the police, participants from both of these locations also disliked the way that officers spoke to them. So 1/5 of these interactions were said to be disrespectful in nature. And so while most of the participants who reported the discourteous manner of police were black, there were a few, specifically 5 incidents from non-black Baltimore residents who were often stopped for traffic-related reasons. For example, after an officer stopped Brian for a traffic-related stop, Brian says that he told the officer that he had a clean driving record. But he says this is what happened. When the officer found out that I had a seatbelt violation, he yelled at me, and he got very belligerent with me. There were also some black residents who reported that officers hurled racial slurs at them and also made other derogatory remarks. For example, Jerry says that the officer stated, "We got us a big one, got me a big one, look at him, look at his feet." He was talking to his partner saying, "Boy, you're a big boy." So because of the officer's racial attitudes towards Jerry, Jerry had told me that he felt like at the time he was like in the 1950s or 60s or something. But I should say that such treatment, it was not just relegated to black males, but it was also inclusive of black women as well. In 8% of these incidences, black residents reported that women were also targets of racial profiling or mistreatment from the police. So there were a few who believed that such poor treatment was tied to the neighborhood where they lived in. For example, Jamia details an incident where she was giving rent money to a landlord, and this is what she says happened. She said, "I handed him, the landlord, the money out of my hand, and the police jumped up and said, 'Get on the ground,' thinking it was a drug transaction." So Jamia went on to say that where she lives at is a largely black neighborhood, and police often come into the neighborhood arresting people. So they had assumed that she was engaging in drug activity. So in some cases, black women were also reported having very comparable experiences as black men. For example, Rosalind states that, "I called a police officer one time. I had a dispute with a neighbor and the police just came to fight, knocked on my door and just grabbed me out the house and beat me up." So this is not surprising because if you recall from the Department of Justice report, blacks are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested than whites in both Ferguson and Baltimore. And again, the report from Ferguson also stated that blacks were more likely to be recipients of excessive use of force by the police. Although many black residents did emphasize the negative nature of police encounters, there were also some who reported having favorable encounters with the police. Specifically, among the 218 incident descriptions that were mentioned, 31% of these interactions were said to be favorable in nature. So one common theme that arose regarding favorable police contact included having a quick response time by the police. This theme was much more common among Baltimoreans who are more likely than Ferguson residents to actually contact the police if they found themselves having been a victim of property crime or theft. So for example, Jerry reported having called the police one time after he was a victim of burglary. Jerry says, in terms of handling that, the response time was fast. And Jerry did admit that he believed that the officer at the time was concerned about the issue, about the incident. And likewise, after having been a victim of vandalism in his apartment, Arnold stated that he called the police, and he said that the police came and took a report and everything was all right. So overall, black and white residents, they were more likely to seek contact with the police when they found themselves having been a victim of car theft or burglary. And during those times, they did express being pleased with the responsiveness as well as the behavior of police officers. So another common theme that arose had to do with police encounters being void of physical or verbal assaults, and this was considered to be positive in nature. And there was one resident, Stanford, who states that he had been stopped multiple times by the police, and he had been stopped, he's been frisked, he had been asked to show ID, and always questioned about his whereabouts, that is, where he was going or where he had just come from. But yet Stanford states that the relationship during each one of those times, it has been somewhat of a pleasant one. "I personally have never been harassed or had a stick drawn or clubbed or punched or anything like that." So here we see that Stanford, he characterizes these police encounters as being positive in nature because it was void of assault. And Stanford believed that blacks were more vulnerable to verbal or physical assaults from the police. And so as a result, he characterized these interactions as being positive in nature. But at the same time, Stanford admitted that the stop never should have happened in the first place because he was not doing anything he was not engaging in any unlawful activity, he was not engaged in any suspicious behavior. And so we'll see in a moment that it was these personal direct and indirect experiences that people had with the police that really drove them to engage in street protests following the death of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. So the question is, why do people protest? So the literature shows that feelings of discontentment and anger are often present among members of the aggrieved group against what they perceive to be discriminatory treatment responsible for the group's suffering. But these emotions, they may not automatically channel into protest involvement. And this may be due because of a lack of resources or fear of repression and or lack of confidence in the ability to actually affect change. When collective action does take place, motivation does play a significant role in channeling emotions of anger as well as frustration towards protest goals. But emotions, they also have the power to demobilize a movement, particularly when feelings of anger and despair of participants exacerbates fear of violence or isolation and even repercussion for more powerful organizations and institutions. Grievances also motivate people to protest. Grievances arise when individuals or groups experiencing inequality become victims of injustice or have a sense of moral indignation about some state of affairs. So when citizens perceive that they have been unjustly deprived compared to that of other groups, then protest behavior becomes more likely. In addition to grievances, individual efficacy is another reason people protest. So this refers to the belief that individual action has the ability or potential to alter the social structure. And group efficacy is another reason for protest involvement. And this refers to the belief that collective protest efforts can positively alter the outcome of a problem. So people are more likely to protest in protest movements, or they're more likely to participate in protest movements when they perceive that it'll assist them in addressing their grievances at an affordable cost and thereby affect policy. Identity reflects a sense of quote-unquote we-ness or oneness based upon shared characteristics or experiences among group members, which can also foster action. So when these identities become politicized, they not only lead to shared grievances, but they also link feelings of inequality with an external enemy. And so when people identify with a group based upon certain characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, gender, etc., then they're also more inclined to protest on behalf of that group. While emotions, motivations, grievances, efficacy, these are all important factors that explain why people engage in protest. However, these factors are really tested when protesters come into contact with aggressive policing during protest events or during demonstrations. This is what is called in the literature protest policing. And so, given that most high-risk protests involve action against the state, the police are often called to suppress protests. In the 1960s and 70s, protest policing was based upon the philosophy of escalated force, in which increasing violence on the part of the protesters was also met with increasing violence on the part of the police. And so this approach was primarily aggressive and confrontational in nature. The brutality of the 1960s policing also led to an alternative approach. That alternative approach was negotiated management. This was common through the mid-1970s to the 1990s. So this approach is focused on the underlying philosophy towards protection of free speech, tolerance for some disruption, de-escalation, and the avoidance of police force unless absolutely necessary. So here, both protesters and the police, they negotiate the use of protest permits that define the nature and also the particulars of the protest in order to decrease the disruptiveness from protesters and also the need for police violence as well. However, as negotiations became less likely, protest policing shifted to what is called strategic incapacitation. So this is where militarized policing was used to diffuse potential threats to public disorder. So the strategic incapacitation approach incorporates numerous policing strategies that are aimed at neutralizing quote-unquote unruly protesters, and this is done through a number of different tactics. It can be done through attempts to control physical space, or it's done through the deployment of new weapons, increased use of less lethal weapons, the establishment of no protest zones, the strategic use of arrest, as well as increased levels of surveillance from the police. So as I mentioned, one response to handle grievances such as police violence as well as mistreatment is to protest. At times, protests, they can go well. For instance, the response from Baltimore protesters was very different from the response from Ferguson protesters in the study. So during the onset of protests in Baltimore, the police department initially engaged in forced restraint. Again, that is that they restrained themselves from initially engaging with demonstrators during the onset of protests. So there was no deployment of lethal force and minimal to no deployment of less lethal force when protests initially began. In the book, there were a total of 102 people who protested. 65 were from Ferguson and 37 were from Baltimore. And because of the quote-unquote soft approach that police initially took, 1/5 of Baltimore protesters, they did report having favorable impressions of protest police than protesters in Ferguson. For example, Jonathan states that police was talking to demonstrators and the police wasn't aggressive at all that day. Likewise, Brianne says that the police handled things very well and they were very peaceful. Even those who did not necessarily have favorable perceptions or attitudes of the police did acknowledge that police responded pretty appropriately during the onset of protests. For example, Deanna states that I think they did all right because they could have done a lot of killings. Nevertheless, the tactical strategies that were used by the Baltimore Police Department, it was not without problems. As the soft approach eventually became militarized, when the Baltimore Police Department, they gathered intelligence that demonstrations would take place at a local mall. When the Baltimore Police Department learned that some students were planning to engage in criminal behavior, dozens of police in riot gears, helmets, and shields, as well as an armored vehicle confronted the students. And so when police prevented students from going home, there were some students who got frustrated and they started throwing rocks and debris at police officers. So a SWAT armored response vehicle deployed a chemical agent to disperse the crowd. And so ultimately, as looting and rioting took place, the police response did become more militarized. So in many cases, officers can be aggressive and violent when policing protests. And this was particularly illustrated in Ferguson. And so one of the themes that I identified as it relates to police aggression and violence has to do with verbal assault. In particular, there were 11 Ferguson protesters, all of whom were Black, who described experiencing verbal assault. Such sentiments were much more common amongst people who protested on the front lines. And so protesters stated that officers often spoke to them in a belligerent manner and called them names as well as used racial slurs. For example, Monique states that the Ferguson police called us monkeys and the N-word. As a result, it led her to conclude that the Ferguson Police Department is racist. And demeaning police behavior could lead individuals to respond in a similar fashion. For instance, there were a few protesters who acknowledged that they countered back by also verbally insulting officers in these situations. And Dante, for example, he details an incident where he was dragged out of his car by an officer after having left a demonstration. He said that the cop told me to shut the F up, called him the N-word, and after the officer talked crazy to me, I said, "Who the F are you talking to?" So such exchange of insults really has the potential to exacerbate a situation, which is what happened in Dante's case, as he went on to state that the officers subsequently ended up beating him up with a weapon. So prior studies have shown that citizens' demeanor, it's often shaped by police officers' actions towards them. And so certainly belligerent and demoralizing police behavior can again exacerbate a situation. So the use of tear gas by police was another theme that illustrates police aggression and violence. So in Ferguson, 32 protesters reported that law enforcement relied on less lethal yet extreme measures to manage protests, and that included the deployment of tear gas as well as shooting rubber bullets at demonstrators. For example, Clayton describes an incident where he protested for the first time, and he talks about the effect that this incident happened on him in terms of the police response. He says that was the only time where I felt like, okay, they don't care. They don't care who they're hurting, they don't care if it's kids, or they don't care if you're out here to protest in a positive way. They're against us and they want to hurt us. That day, that was the worst I ever felt about the police. It was like, okay, this is what you get. They were treating us like we were animals. I should say, up until this point, Clayton actually had a neutral view of law enforcement. After I probed him several times about whether or not he had negative or positive encounters with the police, he said no, he's not had any negative encounters with the police. He said he can't say law enforcement are all bad. And he said he's also never had really positive encounters with the police. But it was this experience here that really colored his perceptions of law enforcement. So in Ferguson, 23 protesters also mentioned the threat of gun use by the police. For example, Javon states that all of the police, while he was protesting, he said that all of the police had their guns drawn. I was on the passenger side, my cousin was driving, and the officer put his gun to me, was like, "Don't move, let me see your hands." But I already had my hands up though, because it's hands up, don't shoot anyways. He told me to get out, gun still drawn to my head, and I'm like, "Why has you got the gun out for? I'm only peacefully protesting." And he put me in the handcuffs, and they had me to the ground for like 2 hours. So such aggressive behavior instilled fear. Certainly it instilled fear and alarm amongst those who were demonstrating, particularly those who were peacefully demonstrating, but it also increased the perception amongst demonstrators that police were responding in a very militaristic fashion. In addition to the threat of gun use by police, 14 activists also reported having witnessed or endured physical assault from law enforcement. This was, again, much more common amongst those who were actually protesting on the front lines. And I will say that women were not exempt from having been a recipient of physical assault. For example, Asia says that me and my daughter witnessed a young woman get hogtied. The police choked her and hogtied her. Similarly, Darius also states that officers knocked one of my organizational members, knocked her out, and they hogtied her. So given the tactics that are used amongst protest police, I was curious as to how protesters respond. More specifically, I was interested in examining how aggressive police tactics that were used during demonstrations, how did that affect protesters' willingness to engage in future protest demonstrations? How did that affect their willingness to actually mobilize in the future? And so what I found is that answer to this question really varied based upon the type of protester. So while I was conducting the interviews with residents and protesters, it was very clear to me that there were different types of protesters. So there were 3 distinct characteristics that protesters manifested, which really depended on their current commitment to the goal of protest. So one type of protester is what I categorized as revolutionary protesters. So these are individuals who essentially protested on a daily basis, either a daily or every other day. Many of them reported that they stopped going to school, they stopped going to work because they essentially believed that their whole purpose in life was actually to engage in protest movements to bring about change. Many of them reported that after having protested, they often slept outside in tents. And so overall, they really expressed a deep level of commitment to the protest movement. Another type of protester are intermittent protesters. So these are individuals, they protested more than 4 times. They were committed to the cause, but they continued to go to work, they continued to go to school, and in general, they held a middle ground commitment to protest efforts. And the last type of protester are what I categorize as tourist protesters. So these are, tourist protesters are individuals who protested less than 3 times, and they really expressed much more curiosity than commitment to protest movements. For example, there were many people who had talked to me who stated that they went to protest movements because they were well aware that history was being made. They got involved in the protest because, for example, they knew CNN was going to be there. It was an opportunity for them to check it out, get on TV, and just see what was going on. So what I found is that revolutionary protesters were insistent in remaining active in subsequent protest movements, even if they had experienced aggressive police tactics that were used towards them. For instance, Maria states that after police were throwing tear gas canisters and pointing me out in a protest, it solidified that I would continue to be active as long as it takes. There were also some Ferguson protesters who were adamant to see change, even if it cost them their lives. I spoke to a relative of Michael Brown, and he stated, "I will not stop protesting because it's my family. And if you want me to stop protesting, you have to put a bullet in my head to do that, because I will be out here every day strong." So despite having been assaulted, targeted, and even arrested by the police, we see that Carlos remained pretty resolute in engaging in protest events. Overall, the threats and actual repression or aggression that was used by law enforcement, particularly in Ferguson, it really created this type of internal solidarity among revolutionary protesters to continue participation in protest movements, despite the very aggressive tactics that were used by police. So similar to revolutionary protesters, there were also many intermittent protesters who indicated that they would continue to engage in future protest demonstrations. However, they emphasized that they would continue to be involved in street protests as long as it remained nonviolent. For example, Rachel says, I'm not getting involved in anything that's going to threaten me to have to go to jail. I don't want to go to jail as a protester. When they're out here with that tear gas and all of that, I don't come out. And so there were also, because of the fear of how police would respond, there were some who were deterred from engaging in future street protests. And so there were some who chose to engage the community in other ways. For example, Jack says, I plan to engage with specific organizations that's youth-led. So there were many intermittent demonstrators who did assert that they would get more involved in the community. Because the death of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, it shed light on some of the structural problems that are going on within the community, such as high rates of unemployment, poverty, lack of resources, underemployment. And so as a result, intermittent protesters sought various ways to engage in the neighborhood and assist neighborhood youth. So in general, contrary, however, to revolutionary protesters, most intermittent protesters were willing to engage in street protests only if it was void of violence. However, again, we see that they were more willing to engage in collective action efforts. And this is similar to tourist protesters who also reported having been deterred by tactics from protest police. For example, Latoya states that after my experiences and things that I've seen, I'm not afraid to admit I'm a little scared to get involved. However, there were some who admitted that they would engage more in community action efforts. For example, Helen states that I plan to teach about the political process and the political system. So even after experiencing high levels of aggressive policing, revolutionary activists, they vowed to engage in future activism efforts. And we see that they remained resilient and resolute and even undeterred by police tactics. However, repressive or aggressive police tactics by protest police appear to deter tourists as well as some intermittent protesters from engaging in street protests. But again, they've sought different ways to engage in other forms of action within the community. And so in other words, they adapted different ways to engage in the overall ideological goal of the Black Lives Matter movement through community action. So overall, what I found is that most protesters and residents in the study, the majority of whom were Black, many of them had negative encounters with the police. It was these negative experiences that then colored their perceptions of the police. The cumulative impact of negative police encounters in both Ferguson and Baltimore, it really set the stage to reactions to the death of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray. And negative views of the police can best be understood by taking into consideration the nature of policing in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Police generally define areas of concentrated disadvantage with large minority populations as quote-unquote bad areas that are comprised of a large number of suspicious people and activity. Police often view residents of poor neighborhoods with greater suspicion than residents who live in middle class or more affluent neighborhoods. And so essentially it's the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood that is often ascribed to individuals in that neighborhood, regardless of whether or not one is actually engaging in criminal activity, but they are being viewed with suspicion. In fact, a suspect's mere presence in low-class but high-crime neighborhoods increase the chances that he or she will become the target of police surveillance, aggression, as well as arrest. Since Blacks are more likely to reside in poor, high-crime neighborhoods, they have increased contact with the police, which then also intensifies the opportunity for conflict between both police and civilians. So what do we need to do so that police officers stop killing Black people? Based upon what I found in my research is that ending the slaughter of Black individuals will not happen by doubling down on investments in the police or even the criminal justice system. America's long history of state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans reflect persistent inequalities and inequities within the criminal justice system. So rather than investing more dollars into the police and more dollars into the criminal justice system, which we have been doing for more than 40 years, investments need to be made in individuals and in marginalized communities. And as a nation, the government has been tough on crime for decades by investing heavily in policing and imprisonment as a means of solving everyday structural problems that disproportionately affect African Americans. But what if instead of being tough on crime, we were tough on the underlying issues that caused crime? Imagine if we had resources that were distributed away from the criminal justice system and into communities. Imagine if funds were spent on prevention and intervention initiatives for both young adults and youth with promise. Imagine if these resources were spent on addressing mental health, homelessness, as well as substance abuse, because currently the way we often treat these individuals is we often ostracize, demonize, and criminalize them. Imagine if resources were spent on bringing more jobs into communities, jobs that paid a living wage, as well as providing quality education. So ending the killing of Black people requires doubling down on investments in the community, not the police and not the criminal justice system. And redistributing resources from criminal justice systems into cultivating communities and cultivating institutions within poor communities is vital. And when we break these structural systems of oppression and seek an alternative vision for safety away from the hands of the police and into the power of communities, I believe that's when we'll begin to end denying many marginalized people their humanity. Thank you.